Hello, Bob Wells here, and welcome back to the Undercurrent Stories podcast, where we dive deep into the hidden depths of our world, one fascinating guest at a time. In today's episode, we're going back in time, back to the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, taking a captivating journey into the grandeur, elegance and daily routines of life in British country houses. Joining us is Adrian Tinniswood. Adrian is Professorial Research Fellow in History at the University of Buckingham, Adjunct Professor of History at Maynooth University, and one of the foremost experts on the history of British country homes. He has authored many books, including The Long Weekend, Noble Ambitions, and his latest book, The Power and the Glory. Today, he's here to give us a front row seat to life in these magnificent homes, from the glittering dinner parties and opulent furnishings to the strict hierarchies and gruelling schedules of the staff, who kept everything running smoothly. What was it really like to live in a country house? And how did these houses evolve through times of prosperity and hardship? So grab your afternoon tea and cucumber sandwiches and get ready for a fascinating conversation with Adrian. Hello and welcome to Undercurrent Stories, Adrian.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you, Bob. And what a marvellous introduction that was. Now I have to live up to it, of course.
Well, there were other things I could have said, but I didn't want it to go to your head immediately.
I'm sure.
By the way, I mentioned there about the afternoon tea. Did I get that right? Was it for both sexes, or was it mainly ladies while the gentlemen smoked cigars or went hunting?
No. Afternoon tea was it actually came in because the gap between lunch and dinner grew longer and longer.
Oh, right.
So that people were lunching at 1 and not having dinner till 8 or 8:30 in formal settings.
Yeah.
So to fill that gap, afternoon tea grew from just being a cup of tea to a full-fledged meal, with your cucumber sandwiches.
All right. Well, I'm pleased I got that bit right. So before we talk about your latest book, which I really enjoyed, I have to say, could you just tell us a bit about yourself, Adrian? Your life's journey and how you got into history and became an author.
Yeah, I mean it's quite a series of accidents, to be honest, Bob. I did English and philosophy for my first degree, and I was writing a thesis, a postgraduate thesis on minor poets of the 1890s. That was my passion. It's a long time ago now, I'll tell you, longer than I care to think. And when I was doing that, I got a temporary job. I'm a Derbyshire lad. I'm born and bred in Derbyshire.
Oh, yeah.
And I got a temporary job at a National Trust country house in Derbyshire called Sudbury Hall. And the minute I set foot in there, I realised that's all I wanted to do. It was so strange. I mean, history had been okay at school. I wasn't particularly gripped by it. It was all right. But the moment I set foot in Sudbury Hall, I thought country houses are how I want to spend my life. And clearly I wasn't going to be able to afford to buy one. So
no.
I had to content myself with writing about them.
Yeah.
So I've worked with the National Trust. I mean, this is about 45 years ago or more. It's a long time ago. But I've worked with the National Trust ever since in one capacity or another. I've been a consultant editor. I've written guidebooks for the Trust. I've served on the National Trust Council and regional committees and expert panels. I mean, it gets a lot of knocks, the National Trust. It's the most amazing organisation. The world would really be a greyer place without it, a much greyer place. So I worked with and for the National Trust. And I've always kind of hovered around on the edges of academia. I wrote my first book in late 80s, I guess now, which was a history of country house visiting. And that came about because I was intrigued. I don't know how well you know Jane Austen, Bob, but there's a point where Elizabeth Bennet goes to take a look at Pemberley, goes to take a look at Darcy's house. And her aunt and uncle, if I remember right, take her to look at this stately home. And I thought, how come, I was involved completely in modern visitors going to country houses. It's part of what I did.
Yeah.
And I thought, how strange that people were going to visit country houses in the early 19th century. And that got me looking at the history of country house and country house visitors going right back to Tudor times and before. So, and this is a much too long a tale for you, but that book led me off in different directions. And, I've now written 20 books on country houses and social history. But also I became more and more closely involved with the academic world. And 10 years ago, I began to run a postgraduate research degrees in country house studies for Buckingham University, which I still do.
Yes.
The MA in country house studies has gone from strength to strength over the past 10 years. It's great. And we have PhDs now. It's a really thriving program. And then 3 or 4 years ago, I moved to where I am now, which your listeners, I'm in the far west of Ireland, in County Mayo, next up America, where it's wild and quiet, and where broadband services have enabled me to keep working and keep researching. I don't know if you find it, but one of the things I've noticed in the past 10 years, it's an obvious thing, I guess, is that with each book I do, the internet becomes more and more important. I used to spend ages trawling around one library or another. Well, most of the stuff in those libraries is now available in my small cottage on the edge of a bog in County Mayo. It's incredible, absolutely incredible. What it does mean, of course, is that your research never stops. When I used to sort of say, set out 6 months to research a book, and then I'd have to start writing it. Well, now, of course, if I want to know, say, what Ferdinand Rothschild was doing, what parties he was going to in the 1880s, in 1875, on the 5th of February, the 7th of February, 1895, I can actually find that out from my desk. And that means that it never stops.
Yeah.
It never ends. The research is always there to be done. So it's a double-edged sword.
Yes, it's quite incredible how the web has changed life, isn't it, over the last 25 years? Amazing.
Absolutely amazing. A revolution.
So most of us have seen country houses, mansions, whatever we describe them as. We possibly have visited them. I'd like to just get an idea before we start talking about the details in your book about how and why they came into being and when the sort of first country house started and when was the golden age of building country houses?
That's a good question, an impossible one to answer. You've got manor houses and fortified manor houses in the medieval period, and probably before that to a certain extent. But the Elizabethans really, the first full flowering of the stately home, as we think of the country house, I guess dates back to the 16th century, when building became a status symbol. I think Ben Jonson, writing about the Sydney's family home, says, thou art not Penshurst built to envious show. And of course, what he's saying is that houses were being built for envious show in those days. The Hardwicks and the Burleys, the big, fabulous houses, the Wollertons, the Longleats. So they're traditionally the headquarters of a large agricultural estate. Now that changes over time. In some periods, it becomes much more common to let out the various farms. In some periods, you take them in hand. But traditionally, you've got a blooming big estate. Thousands of acres. In the Middle Ages, you may actually own 4 or 5 or 6 country houses, and you progress, you move from one to the other, making sure that things are all shipshape and Bristol fashion in them. But it is, it's a home for it's a home for the elite. It's a home for the aristocracy and to a certain extent the gentry. And it's people are always asking me, how do you define a country house? And I tell them, if it's big and it's posh and it's in the country, it's a country house as far as I'm concerned. I'd rather include something we weren't sure of than exclude something and miss it out.
Yes, yeah. And is this? Are there sort of proportionally per acre the same amount in England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, or is it something that's more an English thing?
No, there are more in England, and there were many more.
Yeah.
There are plenty of brilliant country houses in Scotland and Wales and in Ireland, indeed, where I am now, and where, of course, the relationship with the country house is much more complicated. When I first got to know Ireland, my wife's Irish. That's how I'm right. My connection. Yeah. And when we first got together 30 odd years ago, even then, there was a certain ambivalence towards the country house in Ireland. It was, of course, as it had been for years, it was a symbol of colonial oppression. And it tended to be sort of regarded with suspicion, mistrust, or neglected. That's all changed now. I mean, people understand what a pivotal role the country house plays in society, for better and as well as for worse. But England, I once, years ago now, I once decided to find out how many country houses there were in Derbyshire, my home county. And I went anything bigger than a farmhouse or a rectory, so a small manor house right up to a Chatsworth or a Hardwick or a Haddon Hall. And I got to 400 odd.
Just in
That's
Derbyshire?
Just in Derbyshire.
Wow.
In Derbyshire.
Wow.
And there are thousands. I mean, we've lost a lot of country houses. There's a famous statistic in the 1950s. In 1955, one country house a week was being demolished because they were anachronisms. Nobody wanted them.
Yeah.
But there are still thousands left, and we don't know how many. I've seen 6,000, I've seen 4,000, I've seen 2,000 mentioned. We just don't know. No. But pick up any issue of Country Life any week, and you'll see a country house you've never heard of for sale, or two or three. And the fact that they're for sale means that, people are buying them. Some people people have to give up their ancestral seats. The Vernon family had to give up Sudbury Hall in the 1960s. They gave it to the Treasury and part payments of death duties, and they'd been at Sudbury for 300-400 years. So yes, country houses, the ownership changes, but also, people buy country houses and they love them just as much as the families that maybe have lived in them for 3 centuries.
It's interesting. I mean, the book, obviously, you're taking a golden period there of country houses, and having sort of read most of your book, I don't want to steal your thunder. So, or even destroy anybody's sort of, if they want to read the book, to spoil it. But are you able to give an overview of why you chose that particular period of the end of the 19th century and what changes were taking place, please, Adrian?
So there's two parts to that answer, Bob. One is that The Power and the Glory is actually the third part of a trilogy. It's first in time, but it's that I wrote a book called, as you mentioned, a book called The Long Weekend about the country house between the wars. And I wrote that in 2016, I think. And then I followed it up with another one called Noble Ambitions, which was the fall and rise of the post-war country house. So I went up to the 1970s with that. Now, The Power and the Glory is the beginning of the story and the end of the trilogy, if you like. That completes the 100-year period that I was looking at. So there's a practical side to it, but also it is, it's Downton Abbey, isn't it? It's upstairs, downstairs. It is the classic golden age of the country house. And of course, a lot of that is to do with hindsight, because we know, as they didn't, that in that glorious summer of 1914, when everybody was the garden parties were in full swing and everybody thought nothing bad could ever happen, that the world was about to change. It was about to change dramatically for a lot of the landowning classes, in fact, who lost husbands, brothers and sons. I mean, as so many people did. But in fact, the officer class proportionally lost a lot more people in the First War than other ranks did.
Right.
So that there's that sense, which gives it a sort of aura of romance as well, I think. The fact that it is that, the sun setting, if not on the British Empire, although it was, but setting on the lawns of the great houses of the British aristocracy and gentry.
And what fascinated me was the influx of new people that were starting to buy these houses in the sort of late Victorian, early Edwardian period. What were the reasons that the situation was such that the aristocracy wanted to sell or move these houses on?
You've got a number of factors coming into play. I mean, the big one, and the one that everybody cites, is agricultural depressions in the 1870s and 1880s, with cheap wheat coming in from America and Canada, with refrigeration, meaning that cheap meat can come in from New Zealand and Australia, and the agriculture plummets in England, and tenants can't pay their rents, and people start to think about selling their houses or selling off their estates. Now, without wanting to get too boring and legalistic about it, a second factor helps that, because traditionally a big country house, not always, but a big country house is entailed. If if Lord Tinniswood inherits Tinniswood Towers, the odds are that I can't sell it because it's entailed on my son or nephew or cousin or whatever. It's entailed for a couple of generations, and the aim for that is to keep things intact, so that if I'm a gambling man, I can't sort of flog the family jewels and the family stately home because it doesn't actually belong to me technically. Now, in the 1880s, a series of legislation they're called the Settled Land Acts, and forgive me because it's fairly boring stuff, but it has an important consequence. Yeah. The Settled Land Acts allowed people to break that entail, and that meant if times were hard and if I gambled away the family jewels, I could flog the house. Yeah. So you've got more houses coming on the market. You've got an influx, certainly of smaller manor houses coming on the market in the 1880s and 1890s. You've got concerns about taxation. Death duties start in 1894, I think it is. And they're very low in 1894, but they will climb and climb. By the end of the Second World War, you're having to find 50 or 60 or even 70. I think it's 80% of the value of your estate to settle. People couldn't do that, so that they sold. So you've got houses coming onto the market. You've got the traditional role of the country house as the headquarters of an agricultural estate. That's being undercut. You've got railways, and later, of course, you've got the motor car by 1900, and that means access to the country house is more, is easier, and a professional class or an industrialist class that's been slaving away 16 hours a day, for the last 30 or 40 years and sees a country house as the pot of gold at the end of their rainbow. That will enable them to enter into county society. Their daughters can teach in the local Sunday school. Their wives can go sick visiting in the village. They can entertain the county at great balls and garden parties. It's something to aspire to. And the houses are there to buy. And if they're not, then these nouveau riche industrialists will build them.
Yeah. And how were these nouveau riche people sort of received by the people who already had the incumbents?
It's an interesting question, and there's not a straightforward answer because some of these people are so rich that the traditional landed elites can't afford to ignore them or to look down on them. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they think of them as upstarts, and that phrase nouveau riche, there's a kind of a sneer to it somehow, isn't there? Other times, it's a lot more complicated than that, and partly because Edward VII, comes to the throne in 1901, but before that, he's very active in all kinds of ways as a Prince of Wales. He surrounds himself with so many of these new men. He has Jewish bankers like Ernest Cassel and Baron von de Hirsch. He's got Iraqi, Baghdadi, Indian friends like the Sassoons, like Albert and Reuben Sassoon, and Edward Sassoon and his son Philip, who will become very important in the 1910s and 20s. So the king is giving a kind of a seal of approval to a lot of these new men. And that means that the old guard really can't afford to ignore them completely. And also, there are things that we forget as historians sometimes. We talk about movements and trends and what we don't think about quite often is people. Some of these guys were really nice and they threw big parties. What's not to like?
Yeah.
There is that simple. I'll tell you one of the strangest things in that context I came across when I was doing actually the long weekend. I was fascinated by Philip Sassoon, who was a really intriguing character in the 1910s and 20s and 30s. He had two country houses, Port Lympne down on the south coast and Trent Park in Middlesex, and also a huge mansion on Park Lane. And when he had parties, 1,000 people came to the Park Lane. That was a big house. And at one of his parties, a mate of his was invited. That mate, Philip, is a Baghdadi Jew. He invites Oswald Mosley to his parties. Oswald Mosley meets his wife-to-be, Diana Mitford, as she was, at one of Philip's parties. It shows the danger of putting people in silos.
Yes.
You've got this liberal, socially ambitious and very clever Jewish banker of a Jewish banking family with Oswald Mosley, who's the leader of the British Union of Fascists. They're not supposed to get on, are they?
No.
And they do, because
Yeah.
they're mates and they like each other.
Yeah. Hi, it's Pop here. Just a quick interlude. Hope you're enjoying this episode. And if you would like to hear more interesting interviews, we have over 120 episodes to date with many fascinating guests talking about a wide variety of topics, which include music, history, philosophy, fitness, food and drink, adventure, contemporary culture, and many, many more. I'm sure there's something that you'd really enjoy. So all you need to do is just visit undercurrentstories.com or search Undercurrent Stories in any of the podcast platforms. And now back to the show. Yeah, that was one of the things that came up in the book was the amount of anti-Semitism and racism that seemed to prevail in that late Victorian, earlier 20th century. We talk about racism now as though it's gone away, which of course it hasn't. But could you just describe a little bit about what that was like, please, Adrian?
I think that it's important to say that British society in the 1880s and 90s, and indeed right through to the post-war period, was anti-Semitic. There was a strong strain of anti-Semitism in British high society, as there was in working class society. It wasn't just confined to the posh. And what that meant is that there's almost like visitors, people wanted to go to the Sassoon's country party. They wanted to go to Ferdinand de Rothschild's parties, or his brother, his cousin Alfred de Rothschild, threw amazing parties at Houghton. People wanted to go to them, but there's this kind of almost contempt. They take the hospitality and then they go away talking about this ostentatious, aren't they vulgar? They parade their wealth, and it's racism. It's anti-Semitism. There's no question. It's not even, it's not a moot point. But again, Edward VII, as Prince of Wales, has a number of Jewish friends, including, I mentioned Ernst Cassels, who acts as his banker. I mean, he has these friends partly because they're massively rich and he's always hard up and they're always willing to advance him a few £1,000 or to cover his debts. So there is a kind of a pragmatic side to it. But again, because the prince, the king, admits wealthy Jewish bankers and industrialists into his inner circle, people can't afford to dismiss them at all. And you've got, some of the great houses of the period, like Rothschild's Waddesdon Manor, which is an amazing place in Buckinghamshire. It's so full of beautiful, beautiful things. Or I mentioned Alfred Rothschild's at Houghton, a few miles from Waddesdon. And again, Alfred Rothschild had the most he was slightly odd. If I remember right, he had a kind of coach and four, which was driven by zebras around his estate, as you do, because he could. Yeah. He had a private orchestra, which he used to conduct himself with a diamond-encrusted baton. And again, because he could. But there's a technical tension between these newcomers and the traditional, traditional landed classes. But it's not a hard and fast tension. Sometimes it's obvious and sometimes the anti-Semitism is revolting. At other times, again, people want to be at the parties. They want to be seen. They want to be mixed with royalty. And if royalty is invited to Waddesdon for the weekend, I want to be there too.
Yeah. And the industrialists, you mentioned that you talk about a number of industrialists in the book, and I'm thinking here of Singer and Guinness.
Yeah.
Guinness, if you can get some these days, is a different matter. But tell us about some of those industrialists, Adrian, if you don't mind.
Yeah, the one that springs to mind, you're right. Singer and Guinness, certainly. And I'm actually writing a book at the moment about Guinness, the Guinness family's country houses. So I'm immersed in Guinness, so to speak. But yeah, the chap who comes to mind as a kind of a paradigm, if you like, is William Armstrong. Now, William Armstrong starts off as a Newcastle lawyer, and he's a bit of an inventor. He tinkers with things. He becomes, he's an engineer as well, and basically he invents a breech-loading rifle, which the British Army take on, and it makes him massively rich. I mean, he's an armaments manufacturer. He also has shipping. He has this knack of building armor-plated ships for the Navy, then devising artillery which will pierce the armor plating on the ships, then devising better armor plating. And of course, and the government's buying the ships, buying the guns, buying the ships, buying the guns. But he has a big house at Jesmond Dean in Newcastle, but then he has a shooting lodge out on the moors, on the Northumberland moors, called Cragside. And between the mid-1860s and the late 1880s, early 1890s, the brilliantly gifted architect Richard Norman Shaw transforms Cragside into the most magnificent palace. It's a romantic, evocative spot. It's all timber framing and Georgian bay windows and high Tudor battlements and high Tudor chimneys. It evokes a mythical past, as quite a lot of these houses do, actually. And Armstrong loves it. What always intrigues me is when Armstrong has his portrait painted, and you can still see this at Cragside today, he doesn't have his portrait painted standing in front of his shipping works or riding to hounds with the local hunt. He has his portrait painted. He's sitting in an ingle nook at Cragside with his carpet slippers on, and his two dogs at his feet, reading a newspaper, and over the fireplace is the quintessentially bourgeois statement, "East or West, Hame is best." Oh, it's wonderful. He is bourgeois. He has solid middle-class Victorian values. And he is, certainly he eventually gains a peerage right at the end of his life. But I mean, he's the archetype of that kind of nouveau riche industrialist, the incomer, who is accepted, who is certainly accepted. And they were. I mean, one of my favourites, I'm more than a little in love with a girl called Belle Bilson. Belle Bilson worked a double act on the halls with her sister, Flo and Bell. She then married a fellow called Viscount Dunlow. Her father-in-law wasn't very pleased because she was older than Viscount Dunlow. She had an illegitimate child, and the father of that child was currently doing 18 months in Pentonville for fraud. It wasn't the marriage that Earl Clancarty, the father-in-law, had envisaged for his son. However, after a lot of ups and downs, Belle and her husband inherited. He became Earl Clancarty. She became Countess Clancarty. And she was absorbed perfectly into British society. I mean, there's a fabulous photograph of her in her coronation robes, at Edward VII's coronation. She did all the right things. Although she came from a very different background, she played Lady Bountiful. She entertained. She gave to charities. She went to court, attended royal drawing rooms. People could do that, We forget they could do that. They could merge. Sometimes not so well. You mentioned Isaac Singer, who's another a great pal of mine. And there's actually not much to admire about him, to be honest. I mean, he is the man who patented the sewing machine, which made him, he amassed a vast fortune. He lived in New York. He also amassed a vast family of legitimate and illegitimate children, 24 at the last count. And it's not, some of his wives, it's not quite clear whether they were wives or not. He blurred the distinction between wives and mistresses rather worryingly. Eventually, he and his last wife were forced to leave New York, and he came first to Paris and then to London and then to Paignton in Devon. And he built a fabulous house in Paignton called Oldway Mansion. He died in the 1870s, and his son, we're in Brooklyn-Beckham territory here, Bob. His son is called Paris because he was conceived in Paris.
Right? Oh, right. So it's not original then from the Beckhams. It's been done before.
It'd been done before. Yeah. And a Paris singer extended Oldway, turned it into a miniature Versailles, brought in French architects, French landscape designers, and built this colossal palace in Paignton. And it's still there. It's seen It's seen hard times. It's been council offices and one thing and another, but it's still intact. And there's some wonderful volunteers taking care of it. It needs a lot of love, this old way, but there's some fabulous stories about it. One of Paris Singer's mistresses was Isadora Duncan, who used to dance in the ballroom there. She hated it. She hated Devon. She said it was all cream teas and people sort of eating far too much and sloshing around in muddy lanes. But she was there.
Yeah.
And I mean, those Singer is American. You've got a number of American men who come over in the 1880s and 90s, 1900s and settle in England. We know about the women, the bartered brides, if you like, the Consuela Vanderbilts, who are almost sold into slavery by socially ambitious mothers who want their daughters to marry an aristocrat.
So there was a desire. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, not at all. Go.
So there was a desire in American families with money to almost sort of send their daughters across the Atlantic.
Yeah, gilded prostitution, somebody called it. And you're right. I mean, you've got if you've got a hard up duke or earl who needs to re-roof his palace and hasn't got any money because either he or his father have blown it, and you've got a socially ambitious mother in, Newport or New York, who has an eligible daughter and whose husband has a couple of million in railway shares or something like that to sweeten the pot. I think there's something like 128 American heiresses married into the British aristocracy. Wow. And squirearchy in the between about 1880 and 1914.
Wow, that's amazing.
So it is. I mean, it is amazing, and some of these marriages were very happy. I mean, Consuela Vanderbilt, the famous marriage to Sonny, to the Duke of Marlborough at Blenheim, that wasn't a happy match, and they split up fairly soon afterwards. After she'd provided him with an heir and a spare, 2 sons, they split. But some of these marriages were very happy indeed. And again, without wanting to labour it, let's go back to Downton, where you've got an example of that. In that the Countess, she escapes me now. Grantham? That's it. The Countess of Grantham is the daughter of a very wealthy American. What we know rather less about, or we've taken less notice, is the men who come over, and they're really important. Andrew Carnegie, who's born in Dunfermline, but goes to America, makes a fortune out of steel and various other enterprises, then comes back to Scotland, the land of his birth, buys a castle and rebuilds it, Skibbo Castle in the Highlands, a colossal place. You've got William Waldorf Astor, who leaves New York, saying America's no place for a gentleman, a statement which he was never, ever allowed to forget by the American press. He couldn't go back, basically. Oh, really? He settled in England. He became a British citizen. Yeah. He bought Cliveden in Buckinghamshire, an enormous house from the Duke of Sutherland. And then when that palled, he bought Hever Castle, the ancestral home of the Boleyn family. And he was looking for roots. He was looking for a history. He was looking for a past, as so many of these Americans were, I think. I'm talking an awful lot, Bob. You want to say a word here? Stop me, won't you?
No, I mean, I'm all ears, and I'm sure the listeners are all ears because there's so much to say. And as I say, I'm nearly finished your book, and there's a huge amount of stuff to take in, which is fantastic. And I think I was saying before, one of the good things about the book is that because you're focusing on the people, and you mentioned about how you enjoy gossip, it brings these houses alive.
Thank you. I mean, that's what it should
great.
Do.
Yeah. And that's what it should do. And that's a good segue to my next question, actually, which is the people that were in the houses, not just the people that owned the houses, but the servants. Well, there's 2 questions to this, really. Did the influx of the new people change the class structure at all, or did it just carry on? And secondly, what was life like if you worked in a house, and what were the sort of jobs that you did?
I'm not sure it did change the social structures particularly. I think the First War did more to sort of shake those social structures, but than the advent of nouveau riche. But life was, I mean, in a big house, And a big house, the recommended quota of servants was 30 indoor servants. Now, if you were one of those servants in a ducal mansion, in a Chatsworth or a Blenheim, one of the big houses, your life was actually pretty good because the lines of demarcation were very clear. The scullery maid worked in the scullery, the kitchen maids did food prep, the housemaids cleaned front of house, the footman ran errands and served. The rough end of the servant career was the 15-year-old girl who worked as a single servant in a lower middle class household, and she had to do everything. She had to do.
So she would be on her own.
On her own, and she would
right.
be. And there's an interesting theory that those lower middle. I mean, in 1901, there were more people. There was something like 1.1 million people in domestic service. The vast majority of them were women, and it was the biggest occupational group. But there's a theory that the servants that were kept in middle class and lower middle class households, shopkeepers and that kind of thing, they treated their servants badly because they had to emphasize the social difference between them, which was perilously narrow, that difference. The Earl of Tinniswood did not have to reinforce the fact that he came from a different class to his scullery maid. It was obvious, wasn't it? He could afford to be familiar with his servants, in fact, because the gulf between them was colossal. The narrower it was, the more the employer had to reinforce that gap. So yeah, for servants, it wasn't a bad life at all. You couldn't marry. There were a few married servants, but very, very few. So the other thing that we forget is that although some of the senior servants, a butler and a housekeeper, would make a career out of it, most people didn't. I mean, most servants were women, and most women went into service at 14. They left, their average age at marriage was about 26, 27. They left to get married. That was it. So you're actually only in service for about 10 years.
Oh, okay.
And even then, you moved about a surprising amount. If you didn't like your employer or you didn't get on with your work colleagues, you looked for another job. I think at one point, in London in the 1870s, somebody did some research which suggested that servants only remained in their place for an average of 2 years before moving on, looking for better working conditions, more money.
So it wasn't necessarily a career for life. I mean, I actually discovered fairly recently, over the last 5 or 6 years, that my grandmother, who was from the northeast of England, was in service at a house in Crowland when she was about 16 or something. And I guess with the volume of servants that were, being used in England, there would be a lot of them. So probably everybody within their family tree has got somebody who was in service.
I wouldn't be at all surprised. As I say, it was the biggest occupational group in England and Wales at one time. Yeah. There were more servants than anything else. And all but, of that, 1.2 million, all but about 50-odd thousand were women. It was what girls did.
Yes.
Interestingly, although they were recruited from the neighbourhood, wherever possible, country house owners would bring in servants from elsewhere because the ones that lived locally, when they went home on their half day, they could gossip. They could gossip about what was going on in the big house. Yeah. Now, if your family lived 100 miles away, one, you couldn't get there on your half day. And when you did get a week's holiday a year or something, if you gossiped, it didn't really matter because nobody knew anybody. Then you've got, there was a fashion in big households for male chefs. A man cook could command a huge salary, and they were Swiss or Belgian or French. Very, very popular. Ladies' maids tended to be Swiss or French as well. They were the ones who attended personally to the woman of the house. The valet, Lord Tinniswood would have had a valet, and the other servants were never quite comfortable with the lady's maid and the valet in the servants' hall. I mean, they got on all right, but there's always this suspicion that if there was gossip in the servants' hall, the valet or that lady's maid would take it back to their master or their mistress, you know. So it's a very kind of complicated social structure going on there, I think. But sometimes quite a huge one. I mean, 30 servants is enormous.
It's interesting how you were talking about life in a country house, and I've been watching. In fact, I only just finished it this week. The Rees Moggs.
I've got to see that. I've got to see it.
It's actually
it
really
looks fascinating.
Good. Yeah, and whatever you think of the politics, I think you can cast that aside and just look at the way that the house runs. And obviously, the class thing's slightly different now, but it does take you back and gives you a sort of bit of a picture. Probably not as much as Downton Abbey, but it's a fascinating watch.
I've got to see it. And of course, it reminds us that country house life continues.
Yes,
it's not entirely a thing of the past.
No. It certainly it appears as though it would be a lot messier. There isn't the uniform and all this sort of thing now, and they're a bit more on first name terms and everything. But it's a good insight.
And I mean, one of the reasons the First War is usually held up as the kind of watershed for domestic servants, that women found that working in factories gave them, yes, they might work 6 days a week, but at least at 6 o'clock in the evening or whenever it was, they went home. They had independence, and they weren't being referred to, by their surnames. So they weren't being forced to wear uniforms. And that was starting even before the First War, that kind of move towards independence and a demand for better working conditions. But certainly the First War, after the First War, you had people talking about the servant problem and the difficulty in acquiring servants. And that's when you start to see married servants, for example. And that's because, you'll see advertisements for a chauffeur gardener and a cook housekeeper or something like that, and country house owners are forced to provide married accommodation if they want staff.
You mentioned earlier on about your pal, Singer in New York. And I just wonder, after all these years of research and writing books and your academic career, you must really have got to know some of these characters through your research you did. And you can almost, when you're comparing the research, you must get to know them so well.
Yeah, and some of them, you're right. They have, like we've mentioned, like Armstrong, like the Carnegies, like Astor and Rothschild and Sassoon. They're fascinating characters, and they've got their own foibles, they've got their own oddities, but they left behind the most amazing legacies. When you look at Waddesdon or Port Lim or Oldway, these fantastic buildings that sure, the social structures that underpin them have changed quite radically and have disappeared in some cases. But just look at, it's funny, I spent most of my career urging people to think about the country house in terms of its people, as you've mentioned. It's how the house was used. The more we understand about those social structures within the house, the better it would be. And I still think that. But by doing that, by focusing on life in the country house, which is fascinating, I made a career of it, we sometimes forget the reasons we save these places is because they're so damn beautiful. Yeah. They're not history lessons. They're things of, they're gorgeous. They drip with joy, and they're wonderful things to see, and we should never forget that.
No, I think that's fantastic to sort of end on. What do you? You mentioned you were working on the book about the Guinness family.
Yeah.
When's that due to come out, Adrian?
When I've got it written, Bob. When I've got it written.
Good answer.
It should be out either at the end of this year or the beginning of next year. We hope.
Yeah.
The Guinness family is fascinating. By golly, they had country houses. They've got places like Elverdon in Suffolk, the huge house built, in fact, by an Indian prince, by Dulip Singh, last Maharaj of the Sikh Empire, who bought himself a shooting estate in Suffolk and built this fabulous house. The Guinnesses had that; they still do have it. There's Ashford Castle in my part of the world, in County Mayo, which is now an extraordinary, lovely hotel. That was bought and extended by a Guinness. Farmley Park in Phoenix Park in Dublin was at a Guinness House. You know, there's Kelvedon in Essex was a Guinness House. Biddenden in Wiltshire. Yeah, there's about 24 big country houses built by Guinnesses.
I can see why there's enough for a book.
Too much almost, Bob.
Adrian, where can listeners find out more about your work and your books?
Well, there's a website which I don't keep up to date very well, but it's certainly there. And I've got I've lost count, Bob. I think I've written 19 books now. But I've really lost count, which might be a sign of my age. I don't know. But most of them are still available from all good bookshops. The Power and the Glory. Go into your local independent bookshop who needs you, and that's the one. It's there, and I've got a reasonably up to date online presence. If people want to follow me on Twitter or Instagram, just look up Tinniswood, ADE, for short for Adrian, and message me, and I'll message you back.
Thank you.
The books are out there, and if anyone wants to pursue country house studies with our MA program and PhD program at Buckingham, have a look at the website there, and that will tell you what's needed.
And is that course an online course, or are you obliged to actually visit it?
It's actually, though I say it myself, it's rather a lovely course. You do an MA by research. Yeah. So there's no coursework as such. There's no syllabus. You pick a topic and you write a 25,000 word dissertation on it. But we also run a series of seminars, and we run them at the moment at the Reform Club, which is lovely. It's a very civilized, and we get our speakers are the best country house historians, I would say, in the world. Certainly in Britain. We have some fabulous, fabulous speakers, and students get to listen to them speak. They then get to sit down with them at dinner and just chat over. Simon Thurley, who's a wonderful historian, is the chair of the National Lottery Heritage Fund at the moment, and has written a whole series of books. Lucy Worsley is one of our seminar regulars. She's wonderful. John Goodall, who's the architecture editor of Country Life, comes along and speaks to us. So if anybody is interested in that, just have a look. Look up the MA in Country House Studies at Buckingham on the web, and if they've got any queries, my email address is there as well. Just let me know, and I'm always happy to chat. As you can tell, Bob, I'm rather too happy to chat. I can't stop.
Well, I have to say, it sounds like a fantastic course. What sort of ages do the course?
I've got recent graduates in their 20s. I've also had people in their 70s complete doctorates, and all stations in between,
yes,
25 and 75. So there's no, the thing is to have a commitment, have a good idea for a dissertation topic, and to show that you've got some kind of academic weight, even if it was a long, long time ago. Some kind of qualifications.
So you have to have a degree, do you, to a basic degree to do it?
Yeah, unless you can show life experience. If you're a mature student and you can show life experience, which is relevant. If, for example, you worked as a volunteer in a National Trust house for the last 10 or 20 years, that would count.
And how long's the course?
1 year or 2 years. You can either do it over 1 year or do it over 2.
Yeah. Oh, sounds really good. Well, I'll put all those on the show notes. Adrian, this has been a really fascinating conversation. It's been interesting to learn more about life in the country house and with the massive changes that took place at the end of the 19th century. And for me, I think we mentioned earlier on, it's about the hearing of the people and the reading about the people and the characters that have really brought the period alive. Thanks for being a great guest, Adrian.
Oh, thank you so much for making me so welcome, Bob. It's been great to talk to you.